Ready? Hi guys and gals, I'm John Niparadney. Welcome to our weekly fishing show, our seminar, and what I do for a living is I write fishing articles for various magazines, and over the years I've written 2 books, one on fishing Lake of the Ozarks, got all the tips from the top guys on the lake, and this one sells here at the seminar and on my website, www.jnoutdoors.com, and also on Bass and Bob's website as well. And this one is 101 bass fishing tips with all the top pros from the Major League Fishing and BASS and all, and a lot of good tips in there as well. And so we have our weekly seminar, and my partner is Bass and Bob, and Bass and Bob will talk about his endeavors.
I think most people know Bass and Bob and Fishing News Magazine. Thank you all for continuing to come to these every week. Appreciate it very much, and we always have great content. I actually learn a lot from these seminars myself. I usually sit back there and ask a ton of questions because I'm still trying to figure out how to catch them. But a couple of things I wanted to make sure that everybody here knows, and Bass and Bob members watching, is we always have these on Monday mornings here from 10 o'clock to 11 through October. This year on September 30th, we're going to do our seminar is going to be at Ozark Yacht Club, and we're going to do a seminar on graphs. We're going to have people from Humminbird, people from Garmin, and Lowrance will be there. We'll have those units there as well, and we'll have guest speakers talking about how to use those graphs, what you're looking at, how to set up your settings and that type of thing. So that won't be here. It'll be at Ozark Yacht Club, starting at like 8 o'clock in the morning with a $12 breakfast buffet, so on and so forth. And then the other thing I want to mention, and hopefully everyone here can get this word out, is what we're going to do in August. We're going to move these seminars to 6:30 in the evening in August. So each Monday in August, 6:30 to 7:30, right here at the pavilion. And we're going to do that to accommodate, we have a lot of fishing guides, like we appreciate, Big Ed and Coach and Jack and some of the others that help us do some of these seminars, but they're busy doing guide trips and things like that, so they're actually really taking revenue out of their pocket to come and do these, and so we respect that and we appreciate that. We also have some other pros, guys like Marcus Sikora and Roger Fitzpatrick and Dennis Beerhorst and various others that would love to come and do some of these seminars, but they work a full-time job, and so it's difficult for them to do these on Monday mornings, especially when they take off work. They're taking off work to go practice for tournaments around the country and things like that. So it'll help us accommodate that type of schedule. Plus it'll be a little bit cooler because we have a nice cool morning this morning. But it'll be a little bit cooler in the evenings, hopefully. And so everybody just help us pass that word around, and we'll do those at 6:30 on Mondays in August. So our guest today, we're very, very fortunate to have Mr. Michael Harlin. And I think that many of you all may or may not know Michael, but Michael just recently won the FLW tournament here on Lake of the Ozarks. What was it,
24.9, yeah.
24.9, almost 25 pounds.
Yep.
And these young anglers, I mean, you got to watch out for these guys. These guys are freaking good. It's really not so much about fishing against a field of fishermen, it's about fishing against the fish, right?
Sure, absolutely.
But there's a great field of fishermen, and Michael won that tournament and has been very successful cashing checks in a lot of tournaments over the years, for whatever years you've been fishing.
Yeah.
He's a young guy. Used to fish for the Missouri
University of Missouri.
University of Missouri, Mizzou Bass Club.
Yep.
And was very successful doing that. And he works at Bass Pro Shops in Columbia as well. So he's got a nice resume started in bass fishing here, and we're looking forward to hearing, what you have to say. Talk about a little bit about what the bite's going on at Lake of the Ozarks. Tell us a little bit about your adventures winning that tournament, kind of what you're doing, what your practice was all about, and what your thought process was,
Sure.
of course. And did you go into it thinking you were going to win it, or did you go into it thinking, well, I'm on some fish, but who knows?
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'll let you take it away.
Sure,
Just
sure.
go ahead and talk,
Awesome.
and we'll ask you questions as we go along.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank you,
Bob.
Michael.
Real quick, before I get started, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Michael Harlin, like Bob said. I live in Sunrise Beach, and when I'm not fishing, I sell real estate with Remax at the lake, and like he said, I also work at Bass Pro Shops in Columbia. So to start off, I went to college. I actually, I had never fished out of a bass boat until I was 18 years old. So a lot of people have a lot of back boat experience. I do not have any at all. I got a boat when I was 18 and pretty much ran from there. Got to college with Ben and fished some tournaments, and it's all been downhill from there. So to start off, let's before I get real in depth, I want to talk a little bit about my setups, and then I'll talk about kind of how I approach that tournament and how I approach this time of year. I really wanted to talk about the summertime, since we've got all this current moving through the lake. It's a little bit, it's not your typical circumstance. Normally the water's shut off by now, but we've been running a lot of water through the lake with these with the high water levels this year. So I'll start pretty basic. I want to talk about my setups before I talk about how I approach finding those fish. I really did all my damage. I actually caught every single one of my fish in the BFL on a Strike King 6XD. I think this time of year, in the summertime, you're making long casts, deep water. I think it's important to throw a longer rod. In the shallow water, I'll throw a 7-foot rod. A lot of times a 7-1, a 7-2, whatever that may be. Really, about a 7-3 is the shortest rod I throw this time of year. And I really, especially cranking, this is a 7-11. This happens to be an Akuma cranking stick. But I'm throwing a 7'11" bait or rod, and really that's just to get the bait out there a long ways. The longer cast you make, the more efficient you are. The longer the bait's on the bottom, and so that's really a key. So the crankbait I was throwing was on a 7'11" cranking stick, 12-pound fluorocarbon. This is Seaguar and Vizex, and the Strike King 6XD. Another thing with these crankbaits, and you really got to watch. I change the hooks. I know Ben's big on changing hooks. I change the hooks on every treble hook bait I have. I think that's really important. If they're getting the bait good, I really like the the Mustad triple grip. It hooks them. Once you hook them, you're going to keep those fish on all the way to the boat for the most part. Throwing a crankbait,
on your hooks, do you use a smaller, larger size, or same size?
Okay, so that's a really good question. You can get away with a 1/0 on the 6XD, but I found that I like the smaller hook because that long cast and it's really deep, and you're throwing a rod that's got a lot of flex to it. I actually like the smaller hook. I think it's just harder to drive the hook home with the bigger one. So I actually go with a number 2 triple grip. Like I said, you can get away with number 1. A lot of guys actually throw a big crankbait on a flipping stick. I do not. I prefer the more parabolic bend and a little bit more flex. So I do go with the shorter hooks, and you're gonna lose fish. But I actually have found that when I first started cranking, say you're cranking shallow, for instance, and you're throwing a wiggle wart or a square bill, you don't need much hook set there. The fish and the rod do it themselves. But deep, you really have to set the hook pretty hard. I mean, I really lean into them pretty good. Now, you're not slack lining them or anything like that. That rod loads up, and then that's when you're going to pull on them pretty good. And I'll pretty much max that rod out, and set the hook real hard. And I'm going to crank on them just to try and get past that first initial come up. Whenever they bite and you set the hook, they're going to want to come up. I reel once you get those fish hooked. Now, once you get within 20 feet of the boat, I'm going to do a lot of thumb barring. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but I don't really use my drag too much. I will on the hook set, but once I get them within 20 or 30 feet, I'm going to click. You'll hear me clicking the reel in and out a lot, and just letting them run. I'll take my time once I get them within 20 feet of the boat, because that's where you're going to lose them. So I'll really play them once I get them close. But that first hook set, I'm really going to hit them hard and really crank on them to try and get those hooks buried in their face good. Because if you try and just lean into them like you would with a wiggle wart or something that's in shallow water, they're going to come straight up and they're going to jump and they're going to throw your bait. You're going to lose a lot of fish on this. So it's really important that I've found is to really set the hook pretty hard. Like I said, you're not slack lining them, but I'm going to set the hook pretty hard, on that first bite. So. That's kind of how I run the 6XD setup. And one more thing about changing hooks, when you get them from the manufacturer, some are good about doing this, some aren't. A treble hook actually has a flat side and a side that sticks out. And some of those companies actually, a lot of times Strike King comes this way. I don't know if they just don't pay attention or what the deal is. You know, you have a side of the crankbait that the offset side are both sticking out on the same side. You want to make sure that you have one side sticking out this way and one side sticking out this way, so the flat sides are across from each other. That way, if you have fish swiping at it, you've got a better chance at hooking them with one side. You know, I just don't want them, you know, both the sides that are odd sticking on the same side. If that makes
mass production.
Yeah. Well, and some companies they pay attention to it and they automatically, you know, they set them up right. Some don't. So that's something you want to check and make sure that you're doing. Every time you bite crankbaits, make sure that those hooks are facing opposite from each other. You're gonna land more fish and hook more of them. So that's kind of how I set up the 6XD, and then really I stick with mainly a 1-2 punch. Like I said, you know, it worked out for me in the BFL. Every fish I caught was on that 6XD. They were biting it good that day. Some days they don't want to bite it, or at least not right at first. So I'll go with a big jig. This is a 7/8 Omega with a Strike King structure bug. I like the Rage Craw a lot, but let me tell you, they're seeing a lot of those right now. I mean, a lot of Rage Bugs. Or Rage Craws, excuse me. So I'll stick with the structure bug a lot of times this year. It's not as much movement. It's a little bit more subtle and natural, and they're just not seeing near as many of them. So you can do that with like a Sweet Beaver or any other type of trailer, but the ones that really move a lot of water, they work well, especially early in the year when they haven't seen a lot of them yet. But right now, you know, these fish are incredibly pressured. Everybody knows what's going on. Everybody's fishing points. So I'll change my trailer up a lot of times. So this is a Strike King structure bug. I pulled the little side appendages off. And another thing I like to do with this jig, I don't trim the skirt up too much. I'm a big fan of trimming skirts whenever I'm fishing shallow. The only thing you have to pay attention to when you're leaving a longer skirt is that the skirt material isn't impeding the action of your claws. If this skirt material hangs anywhere below where the claws attach, you're going to have problems. They're not going to work right. One will flap, the other one won't flap, yada yada yada. Now a more dead trailer like a beaver, you can really actually let it hang down into the claws. But on a trailer that's got, you know, flapping appendages, you want to make sure that the skirt material is not hanging below where those attach to the body of the trailer. So 7/8 jig, I throw this one. This is a 7.3 heavy FX Customs rod. I was throwing this one on 17. You can throw it on 20. If I'm fishing shallow, I throw it on 20. But deep, I'll throw it on 17. Sometimes I'll even go to 15, especially when they're moving a lot of water. Because when you throw that bigger line, it really creates a lot of drag, and it can move your bait, and you don't feel it as good. It doesn't go to the bottom as quick. There's a lot of reasons why to downsize your line when you're fishing deep. Now, when you get to fishing brush piles, that's a whole different story. But when you're fishing current fish and schools of fish, I like to go with the lighter line. You're not around a lot of structure. So there's a lot of advantages to throwing a little bit smaller diameter line through those schools out deep right now. And that's really what I've been doing, is targeting, you know, offshore schools, points, things like that. So that's kind of how I do the 1-2 approach with the jig and the crankbait. And I'll talk a little bit here about how I actually fish the baits here in a minute. And then the third setup I brought, and like I said, that was a 7.3. That's really the shortest rod I like to use this time of year when I'm fishing deep. This is a 7.7 heavy FX Custom rods. If I can't get the fish to go on one of those two, and I'll throw this hair jig. This is a Picasso, I think. I can't remember the exact model of it. This is a 1/2 ounce. Sometimes you have to go to a 3/8, but this is a 7.7 FX Custom, and I've also got it on 17-pound line. High gear ratio on the jig and the hair jig. This is a 7.3 to 1. And again, you know, it's a 7.7 heavy, but it has a lot of tip to it. I actually throw this rod. I throw a whopper flopper on this rod too. See, it's got a lot of tip to it. So it's a good hair jig rod, and that's kind of my 1-2 punch. I'll rotate through these 3 rods, and one I didn't bring is a Magnum shaky head. I throw a 5/8 Crocker Gator head with a Zoom Mag trick worm, nothing special. On that same rod, I've got several of them, 7.7 heavy. It's got a lot of tip to it. You can throw it a long ways, and then whenever you do get a bite, you move a lot of water. You know, you're moving a lot of bait, so you get a good hookup. So that's kind of my setups as far as what I'm throwing. I want to talk about a little bit how I'm finding these fish. I think that's the biggest key. So, like I said, everybody knows the fish are out on these points. Everybody knows the fish are out on these points this time of year, especially when they're moving current. Typically, the water would be shut off right now, fish would be in brush piles, and so on and so forth. So it's kind of a unique year, and that's really what played to my favor for doing well in this tournament. Whenever I go out and practice for a tournament like this, and I said it on the stage as well, I bet I fished a 12-hour day, a 10-hour day, and an 8-hour day practice. I bet I did not have a rod in my hand for 2 hours of that time. I literally idled and idled and idled and idled. And I think right now when the fish are in schools, you have to be throwing your bait right through the school, or else you're not going to keep up with competition. Guys are too good with their electronics. They're going to find them, and they're in the strike zone all day long. You know, if you set your boat down and fish around a point, you're going to catch fish. You're going to be in that 12 to 17 pounds a day range, and that's not going to get it done this time of year when they're pulling current, because those fish are schooled up, and that's how you have to find those big fish. Now, the key to that for me was idling, and I want to talk about how I kind of have my graph set up and how I found those fish, because there's a lot of ways you can do it. I'll just tell you how it works for me. I run a map I run a Lowrance HGS 12 at the console, and I run a map with a side scan underneath it and down imaging to the left side. It's just how I have mine set up. Most of the time, Lowrance's, or any company, no matter which one you use, their factory settings are pretty good. I usually don't mess with them too much, except for when I'm looking for schools of fish. I'll leave the side scan factory settings as far as contrast and all that goes. One of the biggest keys when you're looking for fish, I hardly ever move my side scan range from 50 to 60 feet. That's about all I'll ever scan when I'm looking for fish. And it's a whole different ball game if you're looking for big long points or ditches or something like that. You can go out 80, 100, 120, whatever. But if I'm looking for fish, 90% of the time it's on 50. You know, I'm only scanning 50 feet. And that's what's going to show those fish nice and wide on the side scan. But like I said,
Michael, do you scan both sides or just one side?
both sides. Yep, I scan both sides. Honestly, I don't find that many fish on the side imaging. 80–90% of the time I see them on the down imaging. And if you do see them on the down imaging, that's when you're going to see them on the side too. Very rarely on this lake are you going to see fish on the side imaging. Now you get on a lake like Table Rock, and you can do it here, but we have so much rock in this range and bigger that it's hard to see shadows of fish on the side imaging. There's just so much going on, you don't really see them off to the side. Not often. You know, we still have those gravel points and stuff, and you can see them out there. But most of the time I'm seeing them in the water column on the down imaging. Now you get on those pea gravel points and you can see the shadows and all that, but that's a whole nother ball game. I didn't find any fish like that in the tournament or in practice. I found them all on the down imaging. And what I do is I look for a good point or a offshore hump, something like that, and I'll go back and forth over it. And you know, I kind of do a boat width distance, because I'm not gonna, like I said, I'm not gonna find them on the side imaging. So what I do is I go back and forth and I kind of follow them. I'll turn right as I go to make my loop. I'll turn around and see where my boat wash was, and that's how I line up where I need to go next.
Do you do a straight line, or
I always do a straight line, because it really stretches your picture if you get to turning like this, and it works for some people. Once you find the fish, that's kind of a different story. I'll kind of turn the boat and try and get on them good. But when I'm making those long passes, the straighter you go, the better picture you're going to get, especially for finding structure and things like that. If you turn, it really distorts your picture. It stretches everything, and you're not going to get near as clear of a picture. So when I'm idling like that, I said on the side imaging, I keep my structure scan factory. This is only when I'm looking for fish. When I'm looking for fish, schools of fish, I'll turn the contrast up a lot higher on the down imaging. And what that does is it gives you a hotter return. You're not going to find structure very well that way. It doesn't work that great for that. But when you crank the contrast up, it really gives you a good hard dot to look at, and you can really see those fish well. If you've got the contrast down to the factory settings, you're still going to see the fish. It's just not as obvious. And when you're looking for what I was looking for during practice, it's obvious when you roll over those fish with that contrast up high like that on the down imaging. I mean, the fish are going to be within 3 or 4 feet of the bottom. I wouldn't even say 4 feet. You know, really 3 feet and less, right on the bottom is where you're going to see those fish. And ideally, you're going to see 4, 5, 6, 10, 12 of them. And they're usually scattered on the bottom. If you start getting them up high like this, yeah, there's probably bass, but they're going to be hard to catch like that. The fish that are feeding or catchable are going to be down there relating close to the bottom, and that's what I'm looking for. So it was pretty phenomenal when I was idling in practice. I'd idle spots, and sometimes you'd be on a point for 15 minutes before you ever saw any fish. And you can see them one pass, turn around and drive over them and not see them. And it's really crazy how it's almost like you disappear. You have to hit them perfect to be able to see them. So if there's a good point that I think there's going to be fish on, I'll spend a lot of time on it.
When you see those fish on the graph and they're down there, what determines what you see? What determines whether you use a crankbait or bottom fish with a jig?
Sure.
How deep are they? How deep are you talking about?
That's a good question. So what determines what bait I use when I see them on the graph is really, like I said, if I see them on the bottom. And if they're within that 3 foot range, they'll go down to eat a crankbait that's on the bottom. And like that crankbait has to be in contact with the bottom the whole time to get bites, in my opinion. You can let it come back up off the bottom a foot or so, but 90% of the time it needs to be digging on the bottom. Personally, for me, I feel like the crankbait's a little more efficient. I tend to get bigger bites. It's not just sitting there in the face of the little ones. They'll kind of get competitive, and you'll catch a lot of smaller fish on the shaky head and the jig. Don't get me wrong, the jig's a big fish bait, but that crankbait really seems to get more quality.
How deep will your crankbait go?
That 6XD, I really don't know exactly, but I know I was catching them off the bottom in about 19 with it. Like I said, I was throwing it on 12 pound and throwing a really long cast, so it gets down there pretty good. I'd say that's about as deep as you can probably get it, but that's about how deep I was getting it. But most of the time, I'm going to throw that crankbait in there first. I can cover more water, I get bigger bites, I can throw it further, and I can hook them at a longer distance. Typically, I'm going to throw the crankbait first, and there's guys that have total different opinions on that. Some guys say throw the jig in there first because it's not going to hang on you, so on and so forth. If you're fishing that right, you're not going to hang it that much. I hardly ever do, and if I do hang it, it's really important to have a plug knocker in the boat so you can get it back. But I throw the jig first. If they won't bite, I throw the crankbait first. If they won't bite the crankbait, I'll throw the jig in there. If they won't bite the jig, I'll go to the hair jig. And so on and so forth. I actually usually will throw the shaky head in there before the hair jig. That's kind of a last resort for me. I miss a lot of fish on the hair jig. So yeah, I usually throw a crankbait, jig, shaky head, and then I'll throw the hair jig in there. But when I'm seeing those fish, I'm so confident, and I checked them a couple times in practice. I'd idle over a spot, and I'm like, okay, those are good marks. Those have got to be bass. They're lined up on the bottom. They're within 3 feet or 2 feet. I'm just sure they're bass. So what I'll do when I see that, usually they're going to be lined up. They're not in a big wad like crappie will get or shad. They're going to be in a line. And when they're like that, I'll mark the edge of the school and the far edge of the school. And that kind of gives me a lineup for the front of the boat. Now, when I go to check those fish, I'll pull up, and it's really, 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 really important to have a GPS puck on the front of your boat. Otherwise, when you pull up to fish one of those spots and the boat's moving around and you start drifting backwards, your arrow is going to spin like this. If you have that heading sensor on your boat, the GPS puck, wherever you're pointing that boat is where you're looking on the map. So I'll pull up, and when you have 2 dots like that, it kind of gives you a line. So you have a dot here, and then I'll try and put my boat in a line with them. That way I'm not throwing sideways through the school. I'm throwing the whole 10, 15, 20, 30 feet, however long they're lined up on the bottom, it's going through them that whole time. And once you do that and you get a bite, mark where the boat's at, because that line's important. So, I mean, as soon as I get a bite, I'm reaching down and hitting my waypoint on the graph with the fish on the line, because I want to know right where the boat was sitting when I got that bite. And the more waypoints you have, the better your lineup is. And that lineup is the whole deal. If you're just fishing around a point, like I said, you're going to catch fish, but you're not going to catch winning quality fish 9 times out of 10. You got to be throwing one line. So that's real important. Having a GPS puck's really important. And in practice, you know, I a couple times, the first couple days of practice, I saw what I thought was good schools of bass. I marked them. I went up to the front. I got my line up, threw out there, first cast, big one, 5-pounder. You know, I was like, okay, I'm not going to fish that school anymore. Go to the next spot. And you know, it might be 6, 7, 8 spots before I see what I was looking for again. But once I do, I'm like, all right, I'm going to make sure those are bass. Stand up, throw out there, crank it down, big one. And you know, I did that probably 3 times, and I was like, all right, I just got to trust what I'm seeing. You know, what I'm marking are bass. It's the right quality of bass. I'm not going to fish for them anymore. And so that's what I did. You know, I just trusted my gut, trusted what I was seeing on the electronics. And that's, I think, a lot of people's problem is when they see what they're looking for on the graph, and then they don't trust what they're seeing. And you know, you don't get a bite on the first couple casts, you're gone, you're looking for something else, and really that could have been a winning school of fish. And that's where you want to go through your rotation and you know, try and get them to fire up, because a lot of times that's the case. I actually, real quick story, I checked that winning school of fish. I caught those fish out of 3 spots, but the spot that I did all my upgrading on, I caught my biggest fish was a 515. I found it in practice and went, oh my goodness, this is something special here. I wasn't on the main lake per se. I was on a secondary point that was not real obvious. It wasn't real steep, and I saw what I thought was bass down there, and I couldn't get them to bite in practice. I threw the crankbait through there, they wouldn't bite it. So I threw the jig in there, they wouldn't bite it. And I'm not kidding you, I was about this far from leaving, and I was like, I'm going to throw that crankbait back through there one more time. And I threw it out there, I was cranking it, I paused it, started it again, got a bite, set the hook, and broke it off. I went, that was probably a catfish. You know, I rolled back in there in the tournament, and they weren't hard to fire up that day. Fortunately for me, they bit on the first cast and pretty much bit on every cast until I left. That was about 10:30. I left them biting on every cast. There was a school, I actually showed Rob a picture of that school a week later, and it was bigger than it was when I caught them in the tournament, and I could not get them to bite anything that day. So that just goes to show you, you know, trust what you're seeing on the graph, and if they're not biting, you got to go through your rotation, try and get them fired up. If they don't bite, move on, come back. You could come back to a school like that 3 or 4 times in a day, not get them to bite 3 times, and on the 4th time you could catch one on every cast. So it's kind of a timing deal. And another thing with the graphing, I probably had 25 spots, I'd say, if not more, that I knew there were schools of fish on. During the tournament, there was boats on about 23 of them. So you know, everybody knows what the deal is. They know how to find these fish. The current deal is it's kind of, you know, it's not too hard to find them. Just managing your schools is the hardest part. So you gotta hit a lot of spots most of the time. You know, this tournament, like I said, it was kind of hard to get on a good spot. So I looked for a lot of off the wall stuff. The first stop I made was on the main lake. I did not stop on the main lake the rest of the day. So because there's just too much pressure, and that was pretty important for me.
Michael, when you're practicing like that and, you know, looking for schools on your graph, do you, during that week before, do you go back and check them, see if they've moved, or have you found that that move around very much, or once they're kind of locked into an area spot, they're comfortable, they just kind of stay there for the entire week or whatever before?
So he asked if when I find schools in practice, if it's 3 or 4 days before the tournament, do I come back multiple times and check them to make sure they're still there, if they've moved or not. Some spots, the fish just roam. They're feeding, they're out there, they're roaming around. There's nothing holding them on one spot. Other spots, those spots, I'm going to idle them in the tournament. I'm going to pull up and I'm going to idle till I see them and I'll mark them and then I'll fish for them, which a lot of people think is crazy. Idling in a tournament can be a little hard. It took a lot of getting used to, but I'll do it. Other spots, there may be a big rock or a foundation or something that's holding them on that spot. If it's a spot that there's something they're sitting on specifically, which is ideal because they're going to be there every time, I won't idle over them in a tournament if they're on something like that. Now, if I don't get bit, that's a different story. But I'll pull up and throw to my waypoint if I know they're sitting on a rock, and that's how they get in that current. A lot of times they'll be sitting on a boulder that's a great big boulder, a car-sized boulder sometimes, or a foundation, and that'll hold a huge school of fish. Those type of spots, I won't come back and check because they're probably not going anywhere unless they're getting fished for, and then they'll still be there. They're just not biting. Those more flat spots that they're just it's a feeding area, it's a dinner table, if you will. Yeah, I'll come back and I'll check those and idle around even in the tournament to try and find where those fish are sitting. So, yes, sir.
What degree cone do you run on your transducer?
I really don't know. I run it at the factory setting.
Like a 15.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how much bottom of that, when you're saying you're sitting in 20 foot of water, how much bottom of that do you think you're actually covering?
When I'm sitting in 20 foot of water, how much, like if...
Space out. But you're shooting a cone.
Sure.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's at 15 degrees, there's got to be somebody here that's a math guy. That's got to be able to tell you how much that is. Okay, we've been working. That's been the topic I've had on guide trips here as late.
Mm-hmm.
How much are you actually covering?
Because, it looks like one line on your graph, but it's really 15 feet wide.
Exactly. You don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Depth in water temperature, water depth is going to be more of a width because it's shooting at a cone.
Mm-hmm.
It's not shooting
Wider.
I pretty much...
Yeah.
If you're running 455,
Yeah.
that's the smaller diameter.
Sure, that's what I've been running for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Then it's
I
a
would rather
smaller
run it
cone.
on a smaller cone, that way it's more precise.
Yeah, but what degree cones do they have?
The 455 is mainly what people, that's what he's going to be scanning with.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a smaller cone. It's about, if you're in 25, 30 foot, it's about an 8 foot circle at the bottom.
3 foot for.
Yeah.
And like I said, I'm only scanning a boat width at a time.
Is it 1 to 3? Okay, so at 25 foot, you're looking at 75 foot. Now, 3 foot, every depth is 3 foot. Every 3 foot is 1 foot. Right. Okay, thank you.
So
it'd be 8.
I was saying that, I idle zigzags. That's to find fish. Once I see fish on that, on a specific spot, then I'll come back and I'll start idling, especially if I didn't see them in a line. Say I see 3 fish or 2 fish. I'll mark them. There's probably a line of fish somewhere. That's a school. I just didn't hit them right. So what I'll do at that point is I'll kind of start making my star at different angles until I see that lineup that they're sitting on. You know what I'm saying? So, if you see fish, there's probably not just 3 of them down there, especially when they're pulling current. When they're not pulling current, that's a whole different ballgame. But if they're pulling current, I'll start changing my angle and how I'm idling just to try and figure out what the exact line I need to be throwing is. Because, you're going to be the most productive if you're throwing it through 20 feet of fish compared to 5 feet of fish. So that was pretty important. But let me talk about a little bit how I was getting those fish to fire up with the crankbait specifically. I have my waypoints. I've got my boat positioning, and once I throw it down there, if you throw that crankbait down there and wind it all the way back to the boat, you're going to catch fish. You're going to hang up, and you're probably going to lose fish. I pause a crankbait a lot, and I mean a lot. and I don't feel a lot of bites. It isn't like a thump like you feel with a jig. When you get a crankbait bite, it's just they're on there. And when
Stops wiggling more or less.
yes, sometimes it'll stop vibrating.
Yeah.
And a lot of times when I'm getting bit, it's right after I paused it, and I'll go to crank it again, and it feels like you're hung up. Keep cranking. If you think you're hung up after you just paused it, you're not hung up. If you just cranked it down the bottom and it wasn't hung and you let it float, it's probably not hung, 9 times out of 10. So you've got to keep cranking, pick up all that slack, and then set the hook. Now, when that bait's sitting still, it's just a theory of mine, I think the fish get it better. If you're winding that thing, a lot of times they swipe at it, they're going to get a back hook. But when you're pausing it a lot, you're going to get a lot of front hook fish, and front hook fish are going to come in the boat a lot more often. Yes, sir.
When you first cast it out, do you start reeling immediately, or do you pull it to get it down?
Nope, I don't pull it at all unless I get it down on the bottom. I think it's really important, especially if you're going to throw it all day, you will wear yourself plumb out if you go to pulling a crankbait. I'll throw it out there as far as I can, crank it, point straight to what you're cranking. Hold the reel loose in your hand. When I'm cranking it, it almost looks like this. Because if you get to grip bearing down on it like this and winding, you're going to have about 15 minutes, and you're going to have to put it down and pick something else up.
Yeah, David Fritz sits down and he actually has his arm like this to keep from wearing out.
So I'll let it kind of do like a circle motion like this. One of the biggest things is pointing right where you're cranking. Instead, if you even just a slight angle like this, you start fighting your wrist. You start fighting that, and you're not going to get it as deep either. If you hold the rod right at what you're cranking and crank it down like this, you're going to get it to the bottom quicker. You're not going to wear yourself out. You can throw it all day. Now, once it's on the bottom, yeah, you can do all kinds of stuff with pulling it, ripping it, starting and stopping it. The more erratic you are with it, the more bites you're gonna get.
What speed reel?
I throw a slow reel. That's a 5.6, I think. Bass Pro qualifier.
That gets it down to 20 feet.
Yeah, you gotta crank it pretty fast, but the slower ratio isn't gonna wear you out as much. There's different theories. Some guys throw 6s, some guys throw 7s when they're cranking. It gives you a little more power whenever, as far as like start and stop goes. You're going to move the bait more with less turns, so it's not quite as erratic when you throw the slower reel. But in a tournament like that, I threw it all day, and it'll wear the snot out of you throwing it all day on a faster reel, in my opinion. Everybody's got a different opinion on that. I'm still kind of old school in that manner, and I still throw a slow reel. It just works better for me.
That's why I asked Jerry and we tried it and threw it, and I thought my shoulder was going to fall off.
It'll do that to you, and even if you do everything right, it'll still wear you out.
David Fritz uses a slow crank and reel.
And I may be wrong, but I think David Fritz still throws his crankbait on braid.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's you're not getting as much stretch, and it's going to dive harder with that braid. But I throw 12-pound fluorocarbon unless I'm throwing like a 10XD or a big Cloud 9 or something. Then I'll go up to 15 or sometimes even 17, depending on what I'm throwing at and how jagged it is. But the smaller line you have, the further you're going to throw it, the more easily it's going to dive for you. So I kind of flirt with that. I bet you in that BFL, I was done fishing at 10:30, and I bet you I retied 30 times, and that's not an exaggeration. My boat deck looked like tag-ins like this just everywhere, because it was getting frayed up on me, and I was cutting and retying. It seemed like I retied all day long, but I'd rather retie 1,000 times than lose a 5-pounder.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's kind of a give and take on that deal. And the more you retie, the less line you have on your spool, so that less you're throwing it. And just one day you can, if you're really catching them, you can cut that spool so far down that you're throwing it 20 feet, 30 feet less than you were at the beginning of the day, and you're not getting the bait as deep. You're like, why am I not hitting the bottom anymore? On the same spot. So it's kind of give and take. Retie the line a lot if you're throwing the smaller line, but yeah, slower reel, longer rod. I really think the long rod's key too for throwing that deep diving crankbait. You can throw it further, and you move the bait more when you set the hook. 7.6 to 7.11. I'll never throw anything less than that on a deep diving crankbait, ever. So, anybody else have any questions? Or
The water's clearing up now, and So you still catch them on the crankbait, or you using a different color crankbait, or what are you doing?
No, sir. This is actually the exact crankbait that I won that tournament on. It's a Strike King 6XD powder blueback chartreuse. I actually changed the hooks twice on this during the tournament. I'm not kidding you. Because it just gets dull. I had one open one of these up, and I don't know if you mess with triple grips much, but to open up a hook on a triple grip takes a lot of pressure. I jumped off one over 5 right off the bat in the morning, and that fish opened me up, so that kind of hurt. But you know, you got to do your best to move on and not get mad. I don't think I said a word. I just fired it back out there and kept going. No, I'm still throwing the brighter colors. I will go actually have the citrus shad tag on right now, which is another one of my favorites this time of year. It's a little bit more natural compared to this, but I don't know what it is about the brighter colors. I think it gets bigger bites. I really do. I don't know why.
Even in clear water.
Even in the clear water. Yeah, when you're down there at 20 foot.
Yeah,
it really changes the light spectrum.
Yeah.
I don't know what it looks like, but it doesn't look like this. I'll guarantee it.
So gray.
Yeah. It may just be, it may look completely different than what this looks like out of the water when it's down there at 20 foot. So, and to be honest with you, in that tournament where I was catching those fish, like I said, it wasn't on the main lake. That water was a lot clearer. You can go 50 yards off the main lake and the water looks different. So my first spot was dirty water. I fished right on the main lake, but after that, I was kind of, I call them sneak holes. I was jumping back and forth through some stuff that wasn't out there, wasn't getting it hit as much, and I think that was the biggest key for me, was finding stuff that was a little bit off the wall. I'll tell you something that I probably shouldn't, but one of my biggest keys to getting bites throwing that crankbait is when I get it down on the bottom, I'll crank it until it loads the rod completely up, and then I'll stop reeling and hold the rod right where it was at and wait till it unloads. After you crank it tight like that, you'll feel it thumping still, hitting the bottom, and then all of a sudden it'll unload and quit. It'll go slack, and then I'll crank it. And when I go to crank it again, they're on there. I'll crank it down real tight like that, and it loads the rod up tight, and I'll just stop and hold it right where I had it. And when I do that, you can feel it still digging for about another 4 or 5 feet, and then once it stops, you can float up off the bottom this far. You go to crank it again. It's like I'm hung heavy. So that was one of my biggest keys. And
were you cast into the bank, or were you parallel?
No, sir. I was not throwing at the bank at all. I was pretty much throwing. Most of my schools were parallel with the bank, and that was one of the biggest keys for me, was throwing it right through that school every time. I don't think any time during the day did I throw randomly at something I didn't know there was fish. I only hit 7 spots. That doesn't happen very often. It just was a good day. I hit a couple after where I started that I didn't get bit on. I had one random fish. I will say I did catch one random one. There was somebody on a spot I wanted to fish, so I went to a point that I knew I had caught fish on a couple weeks prior, just to sit there and wait till they left. And as I was doing that, I caught one that was close to 5. So that one was random. That was a fortunate fish. Probably made up for the one I lost in the morning, because I did have one under 4 pounds and I lost one over 5.
So what were the weather conditions that day?
It was sunny. I think it was pretty sunny. We didn't have any fronts going through or anything like that. From what I understand, it was pretty tough later in the afternoon.
You weren't fishing then?
I wasn't fishing. I was done about 10:30. I went to Alhana and got some ice and took it nice and slow all the way back. I still lost one. It was a real deep fish. Caught it right off the bat in the morning. It was my smallest one. Unfortunately, that one expired on me. But yeah, I went back early. I didn't want to risk being greedy. It's kind of hard to upgrade from there. Yeah, I went back to the Glades and did some other stuff and waited till the first flight was due in, and I went back. I think I was one of the last boats out. I was like boat 122, which was less than ideal with the point bite that we had going on. I was just running down to my spot, and there's just boat. I'm like right on my waypoints all the way. And I actually went by 3 spots that I wanted to fish right off the bat, and I stopped on number 4, and it just happened to work out. So that was.
So you fished the lower end of the lake?
Yes, sir. Yeah, I did.
More current down there?
What's that?
You think there's more current down there?
No, I wouldn't say so. I actually think there's more current the skinnier the water is. The skinnier the water, that's just my opinion. I could be completely off the wall, but I think the skinnier, the tighter it is, the more current rolls through there. You know, if you go upriver where they're pulling 60,000 looks a lot faster than it does on the lower end. You can't even tell that they're really pulling current too much down towards the dam. So I don't know that there's more current. I think the water's deeper, it's clearer.
Bigger fish down there?
I think there's bigger fish down there. I mean, there's winning stringers in every creek on this lake, but not as condensed, you know. You know, there's 25 pounds swimming everywhere in this lake. It's phenomenal. But as far as being able to catch them, that's a different story. So, but you know, if they don't eat the crankbait right off the bat, I'll throw that jig out there. Early in the year, when the fish first get out on those points and they're aggressive and they're less pressured, I'll hop it a lot, stroking a jig, snapping it up off the bottom. I can't hardly get them to bite it like that right now. Kudos to you if you can, but I really can't. It's more of a dragging thing right now, and it's still kind of tough to get them to bite it. You got to really slow down, count the rocks. But any other questions or anything?
How far do you set your down and up when you're looking
That's
at
a-
things like -7, -15?
That's a good question. Like I was saying, Lawrence's and I'm sure everybody's factory settings are really good. One that I despise is the auto adjust. Take your units off auto adjust. Don't let them go back and forth. Like, you know, when you're in 5 foot of water and it sets it to 5 foot, and then you go out to 15, and then it drops down and shows you 15, and then you go out to 35 and it drops down and shows you 35. That ain't good, in my opinion. I keep mine set at 35 because me personally, I can't catch a fish that deep on this lake. So really 30-ish is about as deep as I can find them, or catch them anyways. So I'll set it at 35, and even if I'm in 5 foot of water, I'm still showing 35 foot of bottom. Because what that does for me is the fish are the same size no matter where you're at in the water column. You know, a 5-pounder in 25 foot looks the same as a 5-pounder in 5 foot whenever you don't change your auto adjust. When you do change your when it does auto adjust like that, they're going to look completely different. So you know, a 5-pounder in 5 foot of water looks worlds different than a 5 foot and 35 foot of water. It's going to be a lot. What is it, bigger? It'd be bigger then.
Bigger.
Yeah. So you know, that fish is going to look a lot bigger in 5 foot of water if you're only showing a 5 foot water column. So I highly recommend taking it off auto adjust on side imaging and down imaging. Like I said, for finding fish, 50 or 60 on the side, and I run mine at 35. I'm sure other people, you know, if you don't ever catch a fish deeper than 20, set it at 25.
How much contrast do you got?
So if I'm looking for fish on the down imaging, I really like the higher contrast. You'd probably be blown away if you saw how hot my return is on my down imaging. It's just easier to find those fish. They stand out better. Now on the side, I don't mess with it that much. It just doesn't. I don't find that many fish on this lake on the side imaging. You go to Table Rock, that's a whole different story because they got so much pea gravel. You can see them 40 feet off to the side because they're making shadows on that pea gravel. Here, that's pretty tough to do. You know, you don't see that many fish on your side imaging. Me personally, I'm sure people do. I'm not an electronics wizard by any means.
How about your sensitivity? How you set that?
I am not a huge fan of like surface clarity and noise rejection and that type of thing. I think it kind of, I'll deal with the prop wash in the water column personally, because you're still going to see those fish. When you go to adjusting your surface clarity or something like that, I don't want to lose the opportunity to see fish. So when I idle over a spot, and I don't know if you guys noticed, Rob and I were talking about this the other day. Early in the morning, you'll have a real crisp picture. There's not much in the water column because there hadn't been any boats out all night. You go try and idle over that same spot at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it just looks like fuzz all the way down to the bottom. That's bubbles. That's prop wash is what that is. I won't adjust for that because you're gonna lose fish in that picture. I'll just deal with it. You know, some people are obsessed with that clear picture. It doesn't make any difference to me. I'll look through all that to see those fish, and what you'll see happening when it gets like that, those same fish will get up like this, up off the bottom, and you'll see them 5, 7, 10 feet off the bottom, and you're like, oh, those are white bass. No, not necessarily, not always. When they're like that, just come back and check them again because they're not feeding. If you see them like that, and first of all, if you have your surface clarity on and they're way up off the bottom like that, you're probably not going to see them, or they're going to be really small and look like white bass or crappie or whatever. So if you see them way up off the bottom like that, and you don't have your noise rejection on and all the surface clarity and everything else, I'll come back and idle that again. Because at some point during the day, they're going to be down there on the bottom. If I see what I think is bass. Now that took me a long time to figure out. Like, I idle over a spot, it's loaded, I come back 4 hours later and they're gone. They didn't just swim off into nowhere. They're still around there. And a lot of times they're up off the bottom, they're not feeding, pressure, whatever the case may be, they're just not in a feeding mood, so yeah. Anybody else?
Well, when I think Big Ed had this question asked of him last week when he was talking about crankbaits. Do you find that once you catch one that maybe you're starting to pull that school and pull fish away, and is there some indication you have that, man, I should be getting more bites and leave and come back to them, or kind of or do you throw a jig in there or do something different? That's
a good question. You will pull schools to you. There's a couple theories on that. Some guys will say to take your boat and put it up on the point and crank to the bank, because when you pull those fish to you into shallower water, they're still catchable. You pull them out into 60 feet of water and you're not going to catch them. So you can put your boat on the point and crank them to you. So when you're pulling them to you, you're pulling them into shallower water, and you can still catch them. You know, plink your jig around or whatever after they won't bite anymore. But with what I've been doing as far as throwing a line goes, that doesn't work. You know, I don't want to put my boat on the bank and throw side perpendicular to the school. I want to throw it through the school. So what I'll do is if I'm throwing through a school and they quit biting, or I'm pulling them to me and I start seeing them on the graph, I'll take the boat and spin it all the way around to the other side of the line and then throw it back the other way and bring them back to the dinner table.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm not crazy about saying that, but that's what I do. Yeah, so you can kind of set them back up on the spots. You know, once you start pulling them to you, you'll start seeing them on the graph, or they'll quit biting. So you can kind of spin it back around and bring them back, catch one or two, and then go right back to where you were, because that's the line. You know, one's better than the other. But
with the amount of, as you mentioned, and through some of these seminars, a lot of guys, you know, we know that there's a lot of current and there's fish on points and all that. Obviously, you caught 25 pounds. Actually, you caught 25 pounds because you had that dead one.
mm-hmm.
So 25 pounds. So fishing pressure is not really affecting those fish, I'm guessing, because you caught 25 pounds yesterday. Robbie and Marcus caught 24, almost 25 pounds.
Timing.
What about fishing pressure?
Mm-hmm. The pressure definitely affects them. I think you got to time it right. The first spot I started on, nobody had been on probably all night. It was just a little bit off the wall from where everybody else was fishing. I mean, that spot was getting fished. But what happens is they're not throwing at the school. You know, they're pulling up and they're fishing where they should be, or where they were.
But they think they are.
But they think they are.
Yeah.
So, you know, there was a night tournament that night, if I'm not mistaken. Wasn't there a night tournament the night before the BFL? So either A, it didn't get fished, B, they weren't throwing them at the right spot, or C, you weren't throwing the right bait. So the first spot that I fished was obvious. It's a community hole. It gets fished all the time. I was just probably 40 yards from where everybody else fishes. And then the rest of the spots I fished, me personally, I don't think they were getting fished at all. If they were, it was some weekend guys crappie fishing or whatever. But yeah, you know, those good spots that everybody knows, they're good for a reason. The fish are there. You just have to do everything right, and then you have to time it right. You know, so you know it could be a great spot, and you can pull up there and not catch them, and come back 20 minutes later and load the boat. So Robbie and Marcus just had a good rotation and some good sneaky spots, and you know timed everything right, and it came together. Yeah, same thing that happened to me. You know, everybody has their day. You know, like I said, I pulled back up to that same school a week later, and it had twice as many fish in it, and I couldn't get them to bite. So I fished it twice, and I couldn't get them to bite. But I bet you if I kept leaving and kept coming back, eventually they'd fire up. And that's when going through your rotation's key. But even doing that, I still couldn't get them to go. And I knew they were bass. Obviously, I just caught a pile of fish out of them, and there was more of them there. So
Did you catch all the fish that you weighed in on the crankbait?
every single one of them was on 6XD. Let me tell you real quick, this bait here, I actually broke one off about halfway through my day that was way more tore up than this. I bet this, and if you looked real close, this bait's pretty tore up. This bait probably doesn't have an hour and a half worth of fishing on it. I haven't thrown it since then. I hung it up, but it's chewed, it's tore up, and the bill's all beat up. And I only fished it for probably an hour and a half. And that just goes to show you how important that bottom contact is. You know, you're going to go through baits, you're going to tear them up. The bait that I lost was about 3 times as tore up as this, and I probably had 2 hours on it. I'm not kidding you. I mean, it had all the paint was gone off of it. And
that'll paint them for you. Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So, you know, 2 hours worth of fishing, and it's absolutely mauled. You know, that's just part of it. But keeping it on the bottom is huge. You got if you're winding this through the water column, you might catch one every once in a while. You'll catch some white bass, but you know.
You feel it's kind of torn up, peaked out, kind of tore up a little bit, the bill's a little torn up.
I like it a lot more.
They're still biting it, right?
Oh yeah. I'll take a torn up crankbait over a clean one any day of the week.
Yeah.
I'll change the hooks. I might file that bill down a little bit, but other than that, I'm gonna take that torn up one. It makes me feel better. I know I've caught them on it. I know they'll bite it, and
It worked.
you just gotta change your hooks. Like I said, I changed the hooks on that one twice in the middle of the tournament.
We're right at just about an hour, but you're doing so great. I appreciate it. I have a question for you. A lot of Bass and Bob members, perhaps some here, I'm not sure about everybody here, but you know, fish as a co-angler in some of these tournaments. You know, the FLW tournament, you're fishing in front of the boat, and then there's a co-angler in the back of the boat fishing against the other co-angler. When you're fishing, how you were fishing, what do you recommend for the co-angler to be doing? Because I'm sure you don't want him throwing a big crankbait right behind you, you know, right in that same spot, right? Or
After I caught my 5th one, I gave him one.
I'm sure you did. That's awesome. But while you're in the process of catching them, getting your lineup going, and all that kind of stuff, do you have any recommendations for your co-anglers, or just let the co-angler do whatever they want to do? But if you were co-angling behind you, what would you do?
Sure. You know, I was there, like I said, you can go around the point and catch 12 pounds almost all day long. Now, you might not catch it, you can catch 20 pounds doing that, but it's not as easy to do as seeing them, marking them, throwing right through them, which is what I was doing. And obviously my boat, I'm using it as a line. So it's pointing right at what I'm throwing at, unfortunately for whoever I'm fishing with. You know, that's just part of it. But with that said, I'm throwing parallel with the bank. So you got to think, they have a lot more water to fish than I do in all reality. You know, I'm throwing one line. I couldn't care less what they're doing. They're more than welcome to fish from here all the way out here. And so throwing a crankbait at the bank's not a good idea, in my opinion. Some people probably do it and catch fish, but you want it on the bottom the whole way back. And when you're cranking it down you're losing bottom contact a lot. It's hard to keep it in contact with the bottom. So I think, you know, like I said, the big jig, I wasn't that far off the bank, to be honest with you. You could probably hit the bank every spot I fished. You know, I was fishing 19 feet, so it's pretty steep. And when you have that steep bottom, as a co-angler, I really wouldn't recommend throwing a crankbait because you're gonna have a hard time keeping it on the bottom. But what you can do is you can throw a jig. With that exact setup, I probably wouldn't throw as heavy a one. You know, I'm throwing that 7/8. Sometimes I'll throw a 5/8 depending on how aggressive the fish are. I might even go down to like a 1/2 ounce because I'm going to throw it at the bank. If I'm a co-angler and my pro's throwing a line, I'll lighten it up, throw it all the way to the bank if I can, and fish it all the way back to the boat and just fan cast. Throw your shaky head and throw a jig. If I was a co-angler, that's what I would be doing all day.
How about when you're fishing, like, okay, so that's FLW style. Now, if you're fishing a tournament and you have a partner, partner with you that you're fishing together, and one of you're throwing at a line, or how do you kind of tag team that school of fish if you tag team?
So what you have to be standing at the front to hit that school.
Right.
So what I would do and what I do in team tournaments is let your or your partner walk up to the front, throw that line, and then walk back to the console and stand there and drag through it. And I'll stand at the front and throw that crankbait through it, and you can kind of 1-2 punch them that way. But you're not going to hit the same line standing at the back or on the side, so you can throw up there as your partner, free spool your line, walk back to the console so you guys aren't right on each other, and then you're both still dragging that same line. Yeah.
The hair jig, did you really talk about how you retrieve it?
No, I didn't. So the hair jig, this is a 1/2 ounce. Really, a lot of times they bite the 3/8 a little bit better, or a lighter one better. You just have to be a lot more patient with it because it takes a long way to get to the bottom. Big with this is a long rod and a fast reel because you want to be able to move it. What you're doing with that, you really don't move the bait with your rod very much. I'll kind of start it with the rod. You know, when I first crank it, it's just 3 or 4 real hard cranks, and you want to get that thing, you know, so far off the bottom. And once you do, it's 3 or 4 cranks, and then just hold it with a semi-slack line and let it just drift back to the bottom. And you're throwing it through that school. It works good when the fish are a little bit farther off the bottom. It'll do the same thing when they're on the bottom too and just not biting. I'm probably more likely to throw a dragon bait out there if they're all real stacked tight to the bottom. But if I'm seeing a lot of them up off the bottom like that, even if it's not getting, you know, say the fish are 5 foot off the bottom, I'm only gonna get that 3 or so foot off, but they'll still see it and go down on it. So it's a kind of a like this number here, and then stop and let it drift right back to the bottom and watch your line, and you'll see it jump, and there they are. Like I said, I miss a lot of fish on that bait, a lot. So I really don't prefer to throw it too often unless I have to. So, any other questions or anything?
Michael, thank you very, very much.
No problem.
Really appreciate it.